broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the ESHA webinar for best practices for creating and managing nutrition labels for multiple countries. My name is Ben Miller, joined as always by Alicia. We're going to go through that topic today. And go through a little background as we always do. ESHA Research was established in 1981 as the very first nutrition software solution. Today we offer a Genesis R&D food application, Genesis supplements, the food processor, consulting services, database licensing, and a few other things. Today though, we're going to take a look at the Genesis R&D food application. Genesis Food was released in 1991, designed for product development, formulation analysis, menu analysis, reporting, and regulatory compliance. Upcoming webinars, we don't have any scheduled right now. When you leave today's webinar, you will see a survey. It'll ask you if you have any ideas of what you'd like to see in the future, either maybe kind of going back through topics we've done in the past or some brand new topics. So let us know what you think, and we'll get back to them. We probably will have one for maybe an update release for our food processor software in the next month or two. But aside from that, looking for some great ideas on what you would like to hear from us. Please note, as always, this webinar is being recorded. All of our past webinars are available on our website, and of course, signups for our future webinars will be available once we have some more set up. Submit your questions as we go today. If you have questions on that GoToWebinar control panel, you can submit those questions, and we've got a couple of people standing by from our regulatory team, from our technical support team, to answer questions as we go. Today's agenda, we're going to look at some general considerations for labeling for multiple countries, regulations and supporting information, ingredients and recipes, naming conventions. We're going to look at organization, data entry and grouping, and then label development for label formats and settings, ingredient statement naming. We'll look into a few questions as well. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Alicia. She'll get it started with our kind of first area of topic today.
All right, thank you, Ben. Today we're talking about how you might go about approach nutrition labeling for multiple countries with Genesis R&D Food. Currently available for Genesis are labeling modules for the US, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. To see which labeling modules you have in Genesis, with the recipe open, you can look in the Edit Label features. Labeling modules available to you per your license are indicated in black text. Those not included in your license appear in gray. The current software includes up-to-date labels and options, and a current ESHA cloud subscription always provides you with the latest version of the software automatically. If you need any additional labeling modules or have questions about the cloud subscription, please contact the ESHA sales team at sales@esha.com. Of the 4 regions for which Genesis currently prepares labels, the US, Canada, Mexico, and the EU, none of the label formats prepared for one region could be used to comply with one of the other region's regulations. So you can't comply with Canada's regulations by using a US label, or you can't satisfy the EU regulations by trying to use the label for Mexico. As you approach labeling for multiple countries, you want to be familiar with the regulations for each country. And here are some references to US, Canada, Mexico, and EU agencies and regulations. We have webinars that cover detailed labeling for a variety of specific US labeling topics, as well as webinars for Canada and Mexico labeling, and tutorials and blog articles on all of these. You can find more resources at the e-learning center on the ESHA website, and we'll include links and more detail in the follow-up to this webinar. Some general considerations are, in what countries are you labeling? Are all of the ingredients proposed for a formula allowed in all the countries you're working with? What are the specific fortification requirements in the country you're labeling in? Or are you using the information for ingredients that reflect the proper fortifications? Do you package product in the same container from country to country, or do different package shapes or sizes affect the format of the label you need to use? what amount is contained in the package, and how might that affect serving and other information displayed on the label. For instance, in the US, some packages are required to include a dual column label based on the container size. And in the EU, information is reported per 100 grams or 100 milliliters, but depending on the product, you may choose to also include the portion-based declaration, which would also result in a label with 2 columns. Additional considerations is the product exported from one location or manufactured at different plants. Are the same ingredients used in all formulations of the same product? Are the same steps used in all locations? Do all locations use the same equipment? And does any of the machinery require incidental ingredients that might introduce allergens based on the various country allergen guidelines? Are there any environmental considerations like humidity or elevation that would require specific moisture adjustments or different ingredients to be used at some locations? These can all affect how you work with a recipe in Genesis R&D. So with all of those points to ponder, how can you best approach your recipe analysis and labeling? Can you create one recipe that can be used for multiple countries, or do you need to add country-specific ingredients and create unique recipes for each country? What will save you time and effort? What will ensure the greatest accuracy? The ESHA consulting team says that they tend to create a separate file for each recipe by country due to the variations in regulations and ingredient statement requirements that they encounter. Certainly, the complexity of a formula and the regulations of the countries will help you determine the approach that works best for you. And if you find you need detailed direction, please contact the ESHA Consulting Services team for possible customized training. As a general approach with Genesis R&D within your organization, you want to apply consistency to the naming of ingredients, recipes, and advanced labels. Some suggestions are using an ordered approach to names so that the general terms come first and more detail follows, which can make searching and sorting easier. An example, rather than naming a recipe 12-ounce non-fat vanilla latte, you might name the recipe latte vanilla non-fat small 12-ounce. And another recipe might be latte vanilla non-fat medium 16-ounce, and so on. So as you work, your recipes are naturally ordered. If your ingredients or recipes are intended for a specific location, then include a region code or abbreviation in the ingredient or recipe name to help you identify this. If you use numbers and names, use at least 2 digits. And for numbers 0 to 9, include a 0 before the numbers like 01, 02, 03, rather than 1, 2, 3. Some ingredients may go through several versions prior to finalization. Differentiate the progression of a recipe by including a version indication like VO1, VO2, etc., or with names like the stages of test, R&D, final, etc. If your ingredient or recipe is seasonal or date specific, you might include a date as part of the name. As a best practice, begin with the year first, then followed by month and day, or perhaps the quarter. And also use the user code field that's available in the ingredient and the recipe features. As you enter information, you can assign a user code to help sort and search for items. This could also be used for multiple countries when approaching labeling for those. And in Genesis R&D, each recipe name must be unique and each user code must be unique, so keep that in mind when organizing and naming. In addition to consistency in naming, you can use groups in Genesis to help you organize, search in, and sort your files. Genesis includes a variety of predetermined groups like characteristics, database sections, and food groups. You can also add new groups to your software. You can assign an ingredient or recipe to multiple groups. And you can use the preferences setting in Genesis to always assign newly created records to a particular group or groups. So think about the levels of organization you might need when creating your recipes. And we have a complete webinar dedicated to using groups to manage your files. I invite you to review that webinar. It's very helpful, and we'll include a link for you in the webinar follow-up. Some of the benefits for using groups are filtering searches for items in groups, as well as the ability to exclude items based on the group they belong to. Whether from Genesis R&D, ESHA port, or the Genesis API, you can also set groups to help you export files. You can include or limit exported items based on their groups. And with ESHA security, this allows you to permit the level of access to various files based on groups. And with Genesis API, you can use groups to determine which recipes, analyses, or labels might be published from Genesis to external interfaces. With the idea of using groups when working with multiple countries, you could create new groups based on region and assign ingredients, recipes, and advanced labels to those regions. This could be used to move pertinent information to the region that needs it, or to exclude files and limit clutter for those that don't need to see the content of some of your groups. So again, just a reminder of how groups might help. You could categorize your files by stages of production or ready for export or publication, characteristics or claims that could be made on the recipes, intended access, or really any organizational approach that serves you. One of the entry-level steps in working with Genesis R&D is adding your own ingredients, whether this is by manual entry or importing records. When adding ingredients with multiple countries in mind, you need to consider several aspects of the information you must capture. Is an ingredient even allowed in the country for which you're labeling? For instance, some colors allowed in the US are not allowed in the EU, so that may translate to the need for completely separate recipes. Is the ingredient known by the same name globally, or does it have different names per usage or regulation? What is the appropriate name for the ingredient to be included in an ingredient list? For example, high fructose corn syrup in the US versus glucose fructose syrup in Canada. And how many languages do you need to consider for all of the labels that you need to prepare? When selecting or populating the appropriate nutrient fields to use, you need to know not only which nutrients are used on a given country's label, but also which unit must be declared. Genesis R&D automates this for you in the label formatting, but prior to viewing labels, you must populate the correct fields in the software. For instance, with the new FDA definition for dietary fiber, in Genesis, you populate the dietary fiber 2016 field for the 2016 US labels, but you use the total dietary fiber field for other countries' fiber values. And vitamin A is another example. In the US, vitamin A is reported in micrograms of RAE. Canada reports vitamin A in micrograms of RE. So it's best practice to populate as much information as you can given the supporting documentation. And you can use the nutrient calculator in Genesis to help you fill in the blanks. Genesis includes the nutrient calculator to calculate nutrients from one unit to another. Nutrients calculated include carbohydrates and available carbohydrates, US dietary fiber fields, beneficial versus non-beneficial, vitamin A in IU, RE, RAE, based on plant and animal sources, niacin-related nutrients such as niacin equivalents from milligrams of niacin, as well as from tryptophan, vitamin D in micrograms in IU, vitamin E in milligrams of alpha-tocopherol and IU, folate in DFE from folate from foods and from folic acid, as well as salt and sodium. Some nutrient conversions are simply a mathematical calculation, where others may require you to select from a list of factors depending on the source of the nutrient, like plant, animal, or naturally occurring versus synthetic sources. And then Genesis applies the proper calculation. And you can choose to set the nutrient calculator to automatically convert units for you, or you can set it to be prompted for conversions and calculations so you can work through those more one at a time. To help you view the information pertinent to your labels within the Nutrients to View features, you'll find a number of predetermined sets of nutrients and components. You'll see labeling related sets for each country included, as well as several other helpful sets. There are nutrients that you want to see these are nutrients that you want to see as you're populating data for ingredients or to include on reports, like the multi-column report or the spreadsheet. So as you're working with a recipe or populating an ingredient record, you might want to see a specific set of nutrients. So you can certainly set those with the nutrients to view. And you can create as many new custom sets as you want to in the nutrients to view, and you can switch back and forth between those at any time to see more or less or different information. With multiple countries in mind, you need to be familiar with the mandatory and additional nutrients allowed on each country's label. Within the label features of Genesis R&D and the View Label screen, you will typically see the mandatory nutrients that appear on the standard format of the label, unless you've already been working with the label features and made some changes. Additional nutrients can be selected as needed from the Edit Label features. Common to the US, Canada, Mexico, and EU are the reporting of energy, fat, saturated fat, carbohydrates, sugars, and protein. Some of the countries require and some allow additional nutrients, and although nutrients might be called the same name, they may have different definitions depending on the governing body. Energy might be listed as calories, kilojoules, or both. Carbohydrates might be presented as total carbs or as available carbs. Dietary fiber may have differing definitions. And then additional nutrients per country like vitamins and minerals may be listed. So let's take a quick look at the mandatory nutrients for each of these. Here we have the U.S. mandatory nutrients and a sample standard label. Note that the U.S. lists trans fat, dietary fiber is defined by the FDA, and added sugars is declared. Here's the Canadian list of core nutrients and how those appear on a label. Similar to the US, but they're not quite the same. And like the saturated and trans fat listing of the percent daily value, and the bottom vitamins and minerals are slightly different. Mexico's nutrient set is a bit scaled down in comparison, and Mexico reports available carbohydrates for their carbs value. The EU label sports a smaller set of nutrients as well when compared to US and Canada, and EU also reports available carbohydrates and reports salt rather than sodium as a label nutrient. Then taking a closer look at energy, which is reported on all 4 labels, the US reports energy as calories, and kilojoules may be declared. And the U.S. regulations state several acceptable methods to determine calories. These include using Atwater factors 449 with adjustment for fibers and specific factors applied for sugar alcohols. Canada reports energy as calories, and kilojoules may also be declared. Canada regulation also lists several methods to determine calories, using Atwater factors 4497, applying specific factors for sugar alcohols, glycerol, and polydextrose, and adjusting for fiber. Mexico reports energy as kilojoules and kcal, and they offer a variety of ways to display calories as kcal or cals, and 449 is used to calculate energy. On the EU label, kilojoules and kcals are reported. When energy is calculated, specific factors are used for carbohydrates, polyols, protein, fat, salicitrams, ethanol alcohol, organic acids, fiber, and erythritol. And then just a note on calories with an uppercase C versus kcals. Sometimes we see either or on spec sheets or supplier information. Calories with an uppercase C and kcals both refer to kilocalories, and they're used interchangeably and are used when we're referring to calories in food. And of course, the nutrition labels have noticeably different formatting. You can see those here. The sizes, shapes, serving size information, bolded items called out, bilingual requirements and options. These all make for very different labels. Genesis R&D helps you navigate the general and optional formatting of all of these. In general, when working with ingredient lists, the common and usual name is often used, but be aware of different terms used from one country to another. Again, like the example of high fructose corn syrup versus glucose fructose syrup, or in the EU, E numbers would be declared for food additives, while in the US, the common name would be used. This creates the need for careful application and review of ingredient lists. Be aware of allowed omissions as well. In the U.S., incidental ingredients that serve no technical function in the finished product and are not allergens may be omitted from the ingredient list. Canada uses the term generations, referring to the hierarchy of subcomponent ingredients. Generally speaking, ingredients in third generation might not be required in the ingredient list unless they contain allergens. And of course, you want to refer to the regulations for all countries for all of the detail. Each country maintains its own list of regulated allergens. Several of these, or forms of these, carry over from one country to the next, but not all are considered allergens outside of their respective regulations. So here's the list of allergens for each of our 4 regions we're talking about today. And another view of the allergens just across the board. Terms used may be similar, but not quite the same from country to country. And things like fish may be the allergen term on the list, but the allergen statement on the product packaging may need to state the specific species, as is true with tree nuts, where the package may need to state almonds or hazelnuts instead of just nuts. As you prepare your labels, Genesis calculates the percent DV or relative standard percent, depending on which regulation you're in, and identifies the claims that could be made based on the label information. Viewing the nutrient content claims features in Genesis R&D shows you these qualifications and lets you determine if you wish to make such claims. The claims based on statement in the lower left-hand corner of the screen reminds you which regulation you're in, and you can expand any of the nutrients to see specific detail of the claim or the regulation citation related to that claim. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben to show you where to find some of these features and options in the software.
Great. Thank you so much, Alicia. A lot of great information to think about. And I will take some of that information and go into the Genesis software. To start with, I'll go into some of just the kind of general settings in the application that you can change and adjust, and how those affect doing multiple countries. A lot of it depending on how you structure your organization. You know, if one person's doing the labeling for all of these products, or if you have one person for each different region, things like that. So the first thing we'll take a look at is the preferences of the application. This is going to be the overarching preferences of the whole program. All of the preferences here are user specific, so note that. If you have multiple people doing labeling, one person primarily doing US, one person primarily doing Canada, you can set their regulation right in the general tab here for their more commonly used regulation. Obviously, this doesn't force you to use just that one regulation as a user, but it does change that default. So when you create a new recipe, that will be your default regulation for those recipes. And as you enter ingredients in, if you enter in a percent daily value, it will calculate the amount of the nutrient in the ingredient based on this regulation here. So again, you can switch that as you need. And then we also have our grouping area. Let me switch it quickly over into groups, as Alicia kind of talked about it a bit. In the database tab of the program, under modify, you can create your own groups and view what groups exist within your application. And I've created a regions folder within my Genesis application and database that includes the different countries that we have within Genesis. You know, if I wanted to create a new one, there's a click on regions, new, and maybe I'm doing stuff in China. So I can create a China group as well, hit OK, and it adds that right into our groups that we already have. For your products, when you create a recipe, you can go right into the groups area of the recipe. I'll show you that in a moment, to add those items manually into a group. But if you would like a default, again, on that case of your default being what you would normally put it in, when you create new recipes, new ingredients, you can have items automatically go into groups. So if I am creating items for the United States and Alicia is creating items for Canada, I can go in and my new recipe group would be whichever region that would be, US, for example. I'll go ahead and open a recipe now so we can see some of the more kind of recipe specific settings within Genesis for those multiple countries. Specifically, like I just mentioned, grouping. Grouping is going to be under edit recipe. So when we open a recipe, go into edit recipe, and then that will go into groups, which is the 6th tab down here. And we can select which specific group this is. In this case, my recipe is in my US recipes. I could also have it just be for USA for my recipes area. I've created a few different groups. Obviously, my organization maybe doesn't make the most sense just because it's an example. But in this case, this recipe is being sold just in the US, so I can add that way. And of course, items can be added to as many groups as you would like. So if I'm selling this recipe, not just in the US, but in Canada too, we can check that so you can organize it properly. And then as you are pulling data out of the application, whether it's just right from within Genesis or within ESHA Port, or with the Genesis API as well. The API probably is even more specific because the API is really focusing completely on those groups to determine what to export and when to export it. So if you are using the API, groups are even more imperative to make sure you have organized properly. And then we'll go into edit label for just a moment, just to look at a few of these settings here. And we'll go into it in a moment just for a little more of a detailed look on this. But edit label, the big thing here that I'll mention is this first option, the regulation. Like Alicia said, the ones that you have available within your settings are the ones that are written in black. I don't have any that I don't have available because I have the full, all of the modules enabled. But if you have one that you don't own, it'll be grayed out. And I believe it'll also say contact ESHA sales to add on this module, something along those lines. So it's pretty specific that you don't own it and that you have to add it on. And just selecting those items will select that specific country for your label, and not just for your label, but also the nutrient content claims, the allergens as well. So if I have US selected and I open up my nutrition label, it's going to show me my nutrition label for the US 2016 regulations. But it will also, as we saw that list as on one of those last slides, we have that list of different allergens for the different countries. That's going to also show you the allergens in the contains or the may also contain section. The contain section is going to be the allergens for that country. So for the US, milk and wheat are allergens, and then in the US, celery and gluten are not regulated allergens. So they go into that secondary or that other allergen statement. And if we were to change this label to Canada, it would switch those up. So I think gluten would go into the contain, celery would stay and may also contain. Don't quote me on that. But it would be the correct allergens for Canada specifically. And we can look at that in the allergen statement window as well. We can take a look at those two statements here. And then the other piece that is heavily changed based on what country you select in your edit label area is going to be the nutrient content claims. If we click on the claims area here, if you haven't clicked on it before and it didn't pull that up because I have before, let me cancel back out and show you that really quickly what it will look like normally. The first time you select the nutrient content claims, my computer a second to catch back up to me. The reference amount, if we don't have that as we've already selected it, close my label. I think that's what's slowing me down a little bit here. Here we go. For each time you open the nutrient content claims for each specific country, it will pull open this to allow you to either set the reference amount or the rack for your nutrient content claims, or use the existing. Existing means it's going to use what the serving size is for the recipe. So I were to set it, we say maybe 75 grams is my rack for this specific product. And then we'll go into the claims and it'll show us that based on that specific amount, not necessarily the serving size, which I think 75 grams was the serving size, but you can change that based on that specific setting. And again, like I said, if you go in and create a Canadian label or a Mexican label, it's going to ask you for that setting again and remember it. So if you switch back and forth between those countries, it'll let you select that for each specific one. And then obviously the claims will be different as well. In this case, the claims are based on US, so it has the specific US claims. For to change my label to Mexico, it would have a shorter list because they have quite a few different claims that can be made based on those Mexican claims. And like I said, we'll go back into this edit label area to take a look at one more thing. And this was the thing that I really kind of wanted to focus a good amount of our time on today, and that would be the saving and loading of label settings. I don't know how popular of a thing that is for a lot of people, but certainly is very useful. What that will do is all of the settings we see here, general tab, format options, nutrient options, voluntary, object properties, all of these settings here, you can save into one settings file by going to Save Settings. If we save a settings file, I'll go ahead and just save one really quick. Let's save it onto my desktop. That's going to save all of those settings into a file that I save on my computer. And we can do one of two things, or we can do both of them, but we have a few different things we can do with those. The first one will be load these settings. And that'll be loading it to just one recipe. So if you want to save a set of settings for US, for Canada, Mexico, EU, maybe you have a US tabular label that you want exact specific settings for. So you can change all of those settings specific for as many different types of label layouts as you would like, and then go in, create a recipe, and then instead of having to manually readjust all of those options one at a time, click load, select that file that you want to load from, and go. Or going back over into the preferences of the program, and we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but going back to home, preferences, for the overarching preferences of the whole program, under label, there is a default settings file. This is a user-specific setting, so each individual user in your organization can have a different settings that they would like, but that will be for every brand new recipe you ever create. Instead of pulling the defaults that Genesis has when you first install the program or first purchase the program, you can change those to whatever you have inside of that label settings file. So very specific to whatever you would like to do. Again, kind of going back to that example of different people doing different countries. And my settings file could be US 2016, Alicia's maybe could be Canada. So depending on what you're doing more often, you could have those label settings specific. And then again, obviously that doesn't force you into just that one set of settings. You could have a set of settings for each different country that you then load at your need. And then one more thing we'll take a look at. I know Alicia talked about it a bit, and there isn't too much to it, but we'll show you where it's at both in the recipe and the ingredient, and that's going to be the nutrient calculator. So with the nutrient calculator, we can either calculate the nutrients inside of a recipe, and maybe the available carbs isn't filled out completely, so we'd like to just calculate that across. Or maybe the vitamin A IU isn't fully entered in all of our ingredients, so I calculate that from the RE value that we have from all of our ingredients. We can pull that across. Or inside of an ingredient, we'll open up an ingredient that we have. Inside of the ingredient, if you have a spec sheet that you've gotten from a supplier and it has values for vitamin A and vitamin D, but they're both in IU, and you'd like to pull those across into RE and microgram, we can calculate those by either clicking on the calculate nutrients, and then we just have the option to select the ones that we would like to calculate across. Or when we enter in a value for a specific nutrient, so long as the auto calculations is checked, if we have, say, 500 IU of vitamin A, it'll ask if we would like to calculate the RE and RAE. So in this case, I'll say this is a plant source because it's a peanut. And then we can do the RE as well, plant source. So now it's going to calculate those across so that we have the correct numbers there. You don't have to worry about doing the manual calculations outside of the program. The program will do those for you. And then one last piece that I'll point out that I was going to a little bit earlier is, as Alicia had mentioned, the nutrients to view. Nutrients to view is a huge piece of Genesis. It allows you to switch the nutrients that you're viewing as you go on the fly. And again, this is a user-specific field. So if you change your nutrients to view, if I change it to US label 2016 mandatory, this isn't going to change all of the users in your organization to just that nutrient set. It's going to change it to my view until I change it again. You can create your own custom sets of nutrients. You can share those between users, but they are user specific. So if I create a new set, only I will see those unless I choose to share that with someone else in my organization. So you don't have to worry about cluttering up a giant list of nutrients to view between your whole organization if one person wants a few specific sets. So it really allows you to compare and contrast and be able to, limit that giant list down a bit if you have especially with a large number of different users in your organization. And again, this list from about here on up are pre-built into Genesis. They're already going to be there when you first purchase the program. Then we can also take an existing list, hit modify, and adjust that as we would like and save it as a new name. So maybe I wanted the US 2016 mandatory nutrients plus. Maybe we want to add in water and ash to my list here. We can add those in, and then again save it. You don't want to save it over the top of the existing file, and you shouldn't be able to. It should be a read-only file, so you can't overwrite that. But you can click Save As to then create create a copy of that with a new name. Going back over into our slides now, if you have any questions, if you feel like you need a little bit of extra training, a couple of days instead of just this 45 minutes to go over all this, we do have some upcoming trainings for the Genesis system. We have a Genesis professional training November 7th and 8th in Oak Brook, Illinois. And then we have an advanced Genesis workshop December 6th and 7th in California. And I believe our schedule for at least the first quarter of next year is being worked on right now and finalized. So we should have that information in the next few weeks, hopefully. If those two dates don't work for you, we can get you signed up for one, maybe the beginning of next year. We're going to get into some questions, but first, if you do have any questions, you can always contact us. Phone number is right there. Ask for whatever your questions are, whether it's technical, nutrition, regulatory, or sales. Any of those sorts of questions, just let us know. We also have a lot of helpful resources, our LinkedIn page, blog, e-newsletter, and our e-learning center, which is something that's fairly new within the last probably 6 months or so. I'll jump back over into Genesis for one last thing right now. The e-learning center you can go to from this link right here, or inside of your Genesis software, under the Home tab, there is an e-learning center button right here. So if I click on that, it'll take us right to the ESHA web page. Inside of the e-learning center, you can search for any past webinars, blogs, tutorials, much more. So that information is right at your fingertips. And if you don't see that button inside of your Genesis software, it means that you're not using the newest version of the software. If you don't see it, let us know. We can get you up to date. And if you don't see it, it means you probably have an installed version of Genesis as well. And if you want to look at possibly using the cloud version so that you're always up to date, let us know and we can help you out with a path to transition you over into the cloud as well. With that, I'll go into a couple of questions here. Our first one, can I rename the notes fields headers inside of Genesis? And I'll take that question. Yes, you can. Going back over into Genesis again, each header for recipes, ingredients, and all the different item types have a different header. So if you change the header for recipes, not necessarily going to change the header for ingredients. We can do this in one of two ways. Inside of a recipe, inside of an ingredient, any of those sorts of pieces. We can take a look at our notes fields, and if we just right click on or just left click on the header here, so notes 1, click on it, it'll open us up right to changing the notes titles. Or under the Home tab, we can go to Preferences, General tab, And then we can expand out notes, titles, and like I said, you've got recipe, you've got ingredient, composite ingredient, menus. We can change those titles to whatever we would like. So if we wanted to change that notes title 1 to something completely different so that it's always kind of noted that way for you and your users, you can change that to whatever you would like. Our next questions. What other countries' labels might you consider adding to Genesis? And I'll let Alicia take that question.
Thanks, Ben. So we will consider any and all countries, but we do look to countries with mandatory labeling requirements and those whose labeling formats are established. So some countries work under voluntary labeling, and while they may have some guidelines in place, if they're not mandatory and really set in stone, so to say, that we do look for those that are more the mandatory side of things and have well-established labeling regulations. You can imagine the changes that take place when a country is either transitioning from voluntary to mandatory labeling, or even when they're revising their mandatory labeling, like we see in the US and Canada right now. So ESHA wants to work with finalized rules when available and when we're developing label features for Genesis. So we value your feedback. And as Ben mentioned, when you close out of the webinar today, you'll see a survey that will allow you opportunity to provide us with that feedback. So if you're in a particular country or you're needing to label for a particular country, let us know. We want to see what is interesting to you and what is needed for your labeling purposes. So just let us know. Thanks.
All right, our next question. In the window that shows the nutrients and the percent DVs, how do I know which country's daily values are being shown? I'll open up Genesis again so we can take a look at that. So inside of my recipe or ingredient, be the same for either one. Under Edit Recipe, we can go into nutrients. And it should say at the top of the window, percent DV based on US label, 2016 standards, 1990 standards, Canada, Mexico, whatever it would be. And that's pulling straight from the preferences. So when we open up preferences earlier, under that general tab, we have that regulation set here. The nutrients tab in both recipes and ingredients are pulling straight from this. It doesn't change based on what label you're creating inside of that specific recipe. It's based on this preference right here. So no matter what you do within an ingredient or a recipe, that regulation is always going to be based on this setting right here. All right, our next question, can I share a nutrients to view set with other Genesis users at my company? Absolutely. There's a file inside of your computer that you save every time that you create a new nutrients to view set. If you'd like to figure out where that is, I'm not going to say it right now because you won't be able to remember exactly which exact folder it's in, but there is a folder. We can let you know which one it is. It's going to be under program data. And you can just copy that file, email it to a colleague, send it over, or if you're in the cloud, you should have access to our file explorer, and you can copy and paste those files from one user to the other. And then we have one last question. If I select voluntary nutrients in my nutrients to view, will those show up in my label? Alicia, can you take that one?
Sure. And no, they won't. So the nutrients to view settings, they're separate from your edit label settings. So think of the nutrients to view, again, if you're populating ingredient data and you want to see all the nutrients, there is a select all or show all nutrients, or you can set a certain set of nutrients to view. So that would be shown on things like the multi-column report, the spreadsheet report, the other reports in the software, whereas in the label settings, so you go to edit label, and within the edit label settings, you'll have your choice of, the mandatory or the core or those required will show up by default. There are certain settings that would not display some of those required nutrients. It might drop it down to the insignificant statement, for instance, on a label. And then you'll have the voluntary or additional sets of nutrients within those edit label settings. So that's where you select the nutrients that you want to appear on your label of those nutrients that are even allowed on the labels of the regulation you're working in. So two different ideas there.
Perfect. Great explanation there. That was the last question we're going to get to today. If we didn't get to your question, reach out to us. You can reach out to support@esha.com, nutrition@esha.com, or give us a call. We can answer those questions for you on a one-on-one basis. Or if there was a specific question that was a bit more kind of specific, a lot of the times we don't want to get into too specific of questions that's company specific, things like that. So if there's a question like that, certainly reach back out to us. We'll get back to you. With that, you guys all have a great day, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.